All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, Section 2, Congress and the Remaking of the South. So let's recall that the time period that we're talking about right now is Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is the time period after the Civil War where the nation needs to rebuild itself and also rebuild the relationship between the North and the South. Now, initially, the vision or plan for Reconstruction was that of President Lincoln's. However, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth very shortly after the Civil War, and so therefore Reconstruction then fell to the vice president, now president, who was Andrew Johnson. And an important thing to know about Andrew Johnson is that even though he is a Republican, even though he was loyal to the Union during the Civil War, he is from the South. And so his vision for Reconstruction really conflicts with that of Congress. So Reconstruction really comes down to a battle between these two constituencies. You have Congress on the one hand and the president on the other. The president being from the South, Congress being made up primarily of Northerners. So Congress is the one who acts here at the beginning of this chapter in passing the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is passed by Congress. This was actually passed while Lincoln was still alive, so Lincoln signed off on it. But the Freedmen's Bureau, it is an organization designed to help newly emancipated, running out of room here, slaves. Right, so it's an organization designed to help newly emancipated slaves. One of the big or great successes of the Freedmen's Bureau was in the establishment of public schools. You can see an image of a public school here that was created. You had literally thousands of teachers from the North create public schools in the South. You find that literacy rates skyrocket in the post-Reconstruction period, and that was in part thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau. You also had other organizations that assisted with the transition from slavery to emancipation. The American Missionary Association, or AMA, this was a Christian organization. And so the two worked together to provide things like food, shelter, education, jobs, you name it, they were meant there really to assist with this new transition. Congress sought to renew the Bureau's charter. It was initially set to expire. However, this time, President Andrew Johnson is there in office, and Johnson responds by vetoing the recharter of the Freedmen's Bureau. So once again, we begin to get more of a taste for what this clash between the president and Congress looks like. If you're not entirely familiar, a presidential veto is the ability for a president to strike down, we'll call it a bill, right? A bill is what it's called before it becomes a law. So this president has this particular power. So that is one area. The Freedmen's Bureau is one area where Congress and President Johnson clash heads with one another. On a state level, states were being reconstructed under President Johnson, who had a rather lenient plan. Recall that Johnson wanted Reconstruction to be as quick as possible and as painless as possible, and more or less allowed states to reconstruct and create laws in any way they saw fit. And so under President Johnson, as states began entering into the Union, they began passing new laws called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were state laws really designed to legislate black-white relations. And pretty much what it amounted to was additional prohibitions on the black population that didn't apply to the white population. So you can think of the Black Codes as creating two sets of laws. If you're white, these are the laws that you need to follow. If you're black, these are the laws that you need to follow. And amongst the various laws that were created, there were codes or laws, again, this depended state by state, that more or less denied blacks certain property like firearms, the right to vote, There were curfew laws. There were just a bunch of different laws that essentially made blacks second-class citizens. And what the black codes were designed to do was twofold. One was to recreate the slave system which had been abolished in the Civil War. So one of the requirements in many of these states was that if you were black, if you were an African American, you legally had to be signed to a labor contract. And so this created kind of like a neo-slavery. It wasn't the same exact thing, but really what these laws sought to do was to take newly emancipated blacks and more or less force them into very much slave-like conditions, working physical labor. So labor contracts was one of the ways. Economics was one of the reasons as to why these were created. But it was also social and cultural, and this was meant to maintain a system in the South to persist after the Civil War of white supremacy, and that's exactly what these black codes did. Now, on the one hand, President Johnson is happy to see these black codes being put in action because from his perspective, states can pretty much do whatever they want when it comes to these types of laws. Congress, on the other hand, responds to the black codes by passing the Civil Rights Act, which seeks to overturn the black codes. It goes further as well as seeking to overturn the Dred Scott decision of 1857. This was a Supreme Court case that denied blacks citizenship. Right? So for Congress, for the radical Republicans, for Northerners, this law is designed to overturn the black codes and to extend citizenship. As you might imagine, President Johnson responds to it with a veto, attempting to strike it down. However, in this case, Congress has enough to override, and so the Civil Rights Act does, in fact, become a law. However, laws are not the most permanent, and I should say that in addition to maintaining white supremacy in the social and cultural ways, you also have very derogatory information and misinformation being spread, propaganda essentially, to maintain this idea that whites were superior to blacks. And so this image of a newspaper is one example of that. But one way that you could make something more permanent than a law, which the Civil Rights Act was and was successful in passing, is to create an amendment. So in addition to the 13th Amendment, which we talked about last chapter, which ended slavery, Congress seeks to pass the 14th Amendment. And unlike a law, for a law to be passed, you require a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and then you require a presidential signature. Or if the president vetoes, you require 2/3 of Congress to override. That is, if there is a majority, right, more than just 51%, if there's a majority, you can override the presidential's veto. And the amendment process, though, requires 2/3 of Congress, but also 75% of states. And an amendment is different in that it gets added to the Constitution. So when looking at laws and amendments, the amendments are much stronger, right? And actually very rarely does the United States amend the Constitution because the Constitution is, in some ways kind of the final rule book, so to speak. And so you can always pass laws, but to pass an amendment is to really create something much stronger. And so that's what Congress wants to do. So they draft up the 14th Amendment, which does two very important things. One is that it grants birthright citizenship. This would effectively overturn the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which denied blacks the right to citizenship. It also provides for equal protection under the law. What that means is that the black codes would essentially become unconstitutional because what the 14th Amendment says is that no matter who you are, in this case, either white or black, the law code applies to everybody equally. And in fact, the 14th Amendment has been used as, sort of referenced in every single discrimination case in American history since its inception. President Johnson, on the other hand, goes around and asks the states, because again, it requires 75% of the states to ratify it, and Johnson takes a tour of the states, openly wanting those states to reject it. And so in a lot of ways, this 14th Amendment becomes the focal point for the battle over Reconstruction.